Before getting on with the program proper, Morris Israel would just like to say a few words.
And the few words are these. On the way here tonight, it occurred to me that this is a time, at the end of the year, and it's time to settle accounts and to pay debts, and that the Baltimore Council owes a debt of gratitude that I think I would like to ask you to share. The council has been responsible. I've been a member for since it began, nearly 2 years ago, and the council has been responsible for so many stimulating, interesting, informative evenings that I think we have a debt of gratitude to pay to a genie who waves a wand and produces on the council platform, time after time, fascinating, interesting people who have made this council a very valuable factor in the cultural life of the city. And the genie I refer to is Frank Bird. And he is responsible for the birth of this organization. I'm not involved in it. I know very little about it, but I know enough to know that all of these speakers are brought here through the efforts of Professor Bird, and it's an arduous task. He's been brilliantly successful at it, and we owe him a debt of gratitude, and also we owe a debt of gratitude to the small staff that he has working with him. Most of them are volunteers, and his work this is a nonprofit organization, and the fact that he has brought this thing to fruition and to made it available to hundreds and hundreds of people, I think is a great accomplishment, and I just want to thank him and to recognize his service to the community.
Well, I should thank Mr. Aisbell for those very kind words, which were not expected. Mr. Bruman didn't tell me what Mr. Aisbell was going to say at the beginning of the program. And, of course, the only reasonable thing for me to say is thank you, but also to note that this council depends upon the substantial support, the active participation of its Board of Trustees especially, your participation, and the financial support of a great many generous people. And on another occasion, we'll pay proper tribute again to our sponsors, both our corporate sponsors and our individual sponsors, without whose support this would not be at all possible. But let me formally welcome you to this evening's program, and what I am positive will be a most interesting evening. Before our guest is introduced, I would like to thank the Samuel Shapiro and Company for sponsoring this evening's reception and for being a corporate member over a long period of time. I would also like to remind you again that our next guest on the 6th of January over at the World Trade Center will be the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John W. Vesey, Jr. This evening's address by Ambassador Arens will be followed by a question and answer period, as is our norm. At that time, you may utilize one of the microphones in the aisles for addressing your questions to the ambassador. At this time, I'd like to introduce the chairman of our Board of Trustees, who will introduce the ambassador, Mr. John Bruman.
Maybe I should start by assuring Frank Bird that I have no other surprises for him this evening, so I'm going to stay on the script now. Not very long ago, scholars and observers despaired of the possibility of stability being established in the Middle East because of its conflicting claims of justice, rivalries and passions, and profoundly different worldviews. In recent years, hope has developed that statesmen and diplomacy might succeed in bringing order to the region. However, not all those seeking peace imagine the same path to it. Not all roads lead to Rome, or rather, Rome is a different place for different people. It is clear, for example, that Prime Minister Begin does not agree in all respects with the means to peace envisaged by President Reagan. Israel's view of the path to peace is important to us, not only because she is an absolutely critical part of the political mosaic and a major power in that region of the world, but also because she has been our traditional diplomatic partner and friend in the cause of peace in that part of the world. We are most fortunate indeed to have as our guest this evening to discuss the Israeli view of the path to peace in the Middle East, Israel's representative to the United States, Ambassador Moshe Arens. Ambassador Arens was born in Lithuania in 1925, lived in Latvia, and later settled in the United States. As you know, the three small Baltic states were gobbled up by Soviet Russia in 1940 and are now part of the Soviet Union. He served in the US Army from 1944 to 1946, graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1947, and received his Master of Science degree from the California Institute of Technology in 1954. He was head of the Beitar Zionist youth movement in the United States in 1947 and 1948. He emigrated to Israel in 1949. Moshe Arens served as Associate Professor of Aeronautical Engineering at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa from 1957 to 1962. Between 1962 and 1971, he was the Israel Aircraft Industries Vice President of Engineering. He became Director General of the Cybernetics Company in 1973. That same year, he also became a member of the Board of Trustees of the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, as well as chairman of the executive board of the Herut movement. Ambassador Arens was elected to the Knesset in 1974 and re-elected in 1977 and in 1981. In 1977, he was chosen chairman of the Knesset's Defense and Foreign Relations Committee. He assumed his duties here in the United States in 1982. Mr. Arens' biography vividly reminds us of the interwoven destinies of our two nations. We welcome him, not only as an authoritative spokesman on the Israeli view of the path to peace in the Middle East, but also as one who shares in America's heritage. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce the Ambassador of Israel to the United States, His Excellency Moshe Arens.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, as you've just heard, being Israel's ambassador to Washington is my first diplomatic post, and it may not sound quite right if I tell you that it will also be my last, so I will say that it's my only one because I have no intentions or ambitions of pursuing a diplomatic career. And many people wondered why it was that the Israeli government had nominated me for this job. Some in Israel said tongue-in-cheek that it was because I knew how to speak English. It certainly came at a time, this was back in February of this year, 1982, where there was some perception of strained relationships between Israel and the United States. You may remember the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor by the Israeli Air Force. That was followed by some expressions of reservations here in Washington Thereafter, the Israeli government passed the Golan Law that applied Israeli law and jurisdiction to the Golan Heights, and that was not greeted with much applause by the administration here. So when I was nominated for the job, some of the people who said goodbye to me said, "It's really unfortunate that you received this appointment at such a bad time in United States-Israeli relationships." And then others who had a more optimistic view on life said to me, "This is really great for you. Things can't get any worse." And so I came here, and then sure enough, things got worse. And we've had our stresses and strains in U.S.-Israeli relationships, and I've been kept very busy trying to deal with the situation as it developed. A lot of the stresses and strains, a lot of the differences of opinion that have surfaced have had to do with Israel's military operation in the Lebanon. Some of these differences of opinion have seemed quite severe. Some of the rhetoric has seemed quite strident. And I think on occasion it has overshadowed not only the common objectives that Israel and the United States have in the Lebanon, but also what I would consider to be the very great achievements of Israel's military operation in the Lebanon. In engineering, and you've heard that I come from the engineering world, we sometimes characterize systems in which small changes produce large-scale effects. Many engineering systems are what we call linear systems. Small changes produce small effects. But what we generally characterize as non-linear systems are systems in which a small change will produce a very large effect. And all of us know such systems, especially where the human element gets involved. And I would say the Israeli military operation in the Lebanon is a situation where what can be considered to have been a relatively small action has produced very large-scale effect. I say small action because, as wars go, Israel's military operation in Lebanon was a local war, a small war. Every war is too big a war. Every war is one war too many. Nobody realizes this as well as we in Israel. This is the 6th time that we've had to send our sons into the battlefield since Israel was created. And we lost 400 of our sons who gave their lives for their country in the military operation in Lebanon. So it's too much of a war, one war too many. But as wars go, I guess it would be considered a local war, not a very large-scale war, but it is a war that has produced a number of very large-scale effects for Israel, for the Middle East, and I believe for the United States and the whole free world, of which the United States is a leader. Israel went into the Lebanon with a very specific objective. The population of northern Israel had been hostage to PLO terrorists that had emplaced themselves in southern Lebanon for the past 3 years. PLO terrorists that had taken over southern Lebanon had equipped themselves with Russian-made artillery and Russian-made rocket launchers, and when they so decided, they would discharge the artillery and the rocket launchers at random against the northern part of Israel. This is much worse than air raids. In air raids, we tend to think of a siren, an alert, a time when you have to go down to the shelters, an all clear when the airplanes have gone, and you can come up again after 15 or 20 minutes. Artillery and rockets, that's a case of instant death. And whole families with their children in the northern part of Israel for 2 or 3 years now had been spending days on end, days and nights in the shelters, in an impossible situation. And I don't suppose I reveal any secrets if I tell you that some of the mothers of children in the northern part of Israel in the past few years had talked about leaving that part of the country, had felt that they were not meeting their responsibilities to their own children if they continued to keep them in this area of so great danger. This was a situation in which I believe any government that took seriously its responsibility for protecting the security of its citizens would have acted, and would have acted the way the Israeli government did, by ordering the Israel Defense Forces into Lebanon to eliminate the military positions of the PLO in Lebanon. The declared objective of that action has been achieved. Southern Lebanon has been cleared of PLO terrorists, and that entire infrastructure that they had developed there during the past 7 or 8 years, the northern part of Israel is today at peace. You know that this operation was codenamed in Israel as the Operation Peace for the Galilee, and peace for the Galilee has been achieved. The shelters are abandoned. We hope forever. And men, women, and children live their lives, go about their occupations in factories and schools and kindergartens as people should in any peaceful part of the world. We still bear the scars of PLO terrorism in Nahariya and in Metula, in Kiryat Shmona, and in the kibbutzim and moshavim, but the feeling there is that this will never return again. And this has been the signal achievement of the military operation in which 400 Israeli young men gave their lives. But the achievements of that operation go way beyond Israel's specific objective. The PLO had been operating in Lebanon ever since September of 1970, what they refer to as Black September, the month in which they tried to take over Jordan and bring down King Hussein, the ruler of Jordan, the month in which King Hussein was successful in crushing the PLO in Jordan and forcing them to leave their bases and leave their armories and move on from Jordan to Lebanon, whose government was not strong enough to prevent them from setting themselves up independently in total disregard of the Lebanese authority, or the authority of the Lebanese government. The PLO, a terrorist organization, may be the organization that has conducted more terrorist activity, whose actions have claimed more lives of innocent victims than that of any terrorist organization in the recorded history of humankind. The PLO established itself in Lebanon from Beirut down to the Israeli border, in effect in a mini-state of its own, training facilities, armories, underground tunnels, command headquarters, public relations facilities, in a manner in which I believe a terrorist organization had never been able to operate before. Terrorist organizations, and there have been so many, have always operated underground, have always had to operate in fear of the forces of law and order, running away from these forces. The PLO established itself above ground. And if you look at their achievements in quotation marks, their murderous acts throughout the world, their successes in quotation marks, you have to ascribe most of it to the fact that they were able to establish themselves above ground in a state of their own with Russian arms paid for by Saudi Arabia. They have been dealt a grievous blow Their infrastructure has been dismantled. Most of the PLO terrorists have had to leave Lebanon. And I think it is safe to say that they will never again enjoy that freedom of action in any of the countries in which they have been reluctantly granted a haven that they have enjoyed in the Lebanon. And most of the countries in which they've been received, after much negotiation and considerable pressure, they are in effect under internment. Because those governments, whether it is the government of Iraq or Syria or Tunisia or Jordan, those governments are very much concerned for their own stability and very much concerned that the PLO might destabilize their rule in those very countries. So PLO terrorism against Israel has been dealt a heavy blow. They will never again have the capability to wreak the kind of destruction that they have done in past years. The PLO practiced terrorism against Lebanon in conjunction with the Syrian army. That will not happen again. The PLO from Lebanon carried out and commanded an international network of terrorism. The Red Brigades in Italy were supplied and trained by the PLO. The Baader Meinhof gang in Germany was supplied and trained by the PLO. The man who attempted to assassinate the Pope. The strings were evidently pulled in Bulgaria and maybe by the KGB in the Soviet Union. The man himself was trained by the PLO in Lebanon. The PLO from Lebanon reached out all the way to Central America, to South America, in training and in supporting and in instructing and equipping the subversive forces in that part of the world. 5 American ambassadors were assassinated by the PLO in the past few years. Their terror was not directed only against Israel or only against Jewish targets. That was international terror. And I believe that Israel's army in the Lebanon has put a stop to it, has defeated it, I believe to the benefit of the entire world. And I believe the blow that has been struck against the PLO in Lebanon is also a blow for peace in the Middle East. Because the PLO was not only the most rejectionist element in the Arab world, the one that rejected all contact with Israel, all negotiation with Israel, and all accommodation with Israel. But the PLO used the weapon of terror against anyone in the Arab world who was ready to negotiate with Israel and who was ready for an accommodation with Israel. And the list of Arab leaders, prime ministers, and ministers, and Palestinian inhabitants of Judea and Samaria and Gaza who were assassinated by the PLO because they had expressed a readiness to participate in the Camp David process is a very long list. And I believe that removing that fear from the hearts of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, from the hearts of Arab leaders in Arab countries, whether it's Jordan or Saudi Arabia, I believe that that is the first step, not the final step, but that is a first and important step towards additional progress in the march towards peace in the Middle East. Israel's military operation in Lebanon has been a big step ahead for Lebanon itself. We listened to the rhetoric of some of Lebanon's leaders, and we may be inclined to forget it. But Lebanon was a state in name only before the beginning of Israel's military operation. The Lebanese government did not exercise sovereignty over 1 square inch of Lebanese territory. Lebanon was an occupied country by the Syrian army, by the PLO. Lebanon had been dragged into 7 years of tragic bloodshed. 100,000 Lebanese had been killed during the past 7 years at a rate of 10 to 15,000 a year, a killing that would have continued had it not been for Israel's military operation, a killing that still continues in those parts of Lebanon in which the Israeli army is not present. 500,000 Lebanese became refugees during those 7 years and left Lebanon for other parts of the world. Many have come to the United States. All that has changed. We now talk about a new page having been turned in the history of Lebanon. We talk about Lebanon becoming independent again, the Lebanese government exercising its sovereignty, Lebanon being a country allied with the West, and Lebanon being a country that will live at peace and sign a peace treaty with the State of Israel. But the achievements of Israel's military operation in the Lebanon go beyond Israel and Lebanon itself. Prior to June 6th, when the operation started, the Middle East was seen as an arena of competition between East and West, between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was a feeling that the Soviets were penetrating the Middle East almost inexorably. In Ethiopia, in South Yemen with their proxies, Soviet influence in Iraq, Soviet influence in Syria, the Soviet ambassador in Beirut, Soldatov, the most important man in the Lebanon, and we're next, reaching out for those so vital interests to the Western world, reaching out for the oil wells that supplied much of the Western economy. All that has changed. The Soviets have been moved off the chessboard in the Middle East. Stock of the Russians is down to zero in the Middle East. Arab leaders are looking towards Washington, going to Washington. Nobody's going to Moscow. And that's a major change in what is a very important part of the world, not only for us in Israel, but for you here in the United States. But even a step beyond that, on the global scale, you know that the Syrian army was outfitted with Soviet weaponry, with the best of Soviet weaponry, and so in this operation, weapons were tested, certain results were achieved that I believe are going to be of major significance as regards East-West relations around the world. The Syrians fielded in Lebanon Soviet surface-to-air missile systems. This was not our first encounter with Soviet surface-to-air missile systems. The United States Air Force had encountered them in Vietnam. The Israel Air Force had encountered them in the Yom Kippur War. 1/3 of Israel's Air Force was shot out of the skies in 18 days of fighting during the Yom Kippur War by these very same surface-to-air missiles operated in Egypt and operated in Syria. There was a feeling in the world that the technology of surface-to-air missiles had changed the rules of warfare and was depriving tactical air forces of their ability to support ground forces as the Israeli Air Force had supported Israeli ground forces during the Six-Day War. The estimate in NATO was that if there were to be an outbreak of fighting in Western Europe, half of the NATO Air Force would be shot out of the sky during the very first few days of fighting by Soviet surface-to-air missile systems. The Israeli Air Force managed to eliminate all of the surface-to-air missile batteries, SA-2s, SA-3s, and SA-6s in Lebanon without the loss of a single airplane. The Soviets airlifted their latest missile, the SA-8, in an obvious attempt to prove or to test that missile against Israeli weaponry and tactics, and that SA-8 missile battery was destroyed the very first day that it was emplaced in Lebanon. It is clear that we in Israel, and that means that we in the West, today have the ability of dealing with these systems and dealing with them effectively. I think it had been well known that the Israeli Air Force enjoyed considerable superiority over the Syrian Air Force, that we had better equipment, primarily American equipment, some aircraft of our own design and manufacture, that they were better than the Soviet MiGs flown by Syrian pilots, that the airborne systems, the electronics and the ordnance was better, and I think we had reason to believe that our pilots were better. But nevertheless, the fact that in air combat, 86 Syrian MiGs were shot down without the loss of a single Israeli aircraft, you can be sure is giving the Russian Air Force generals something very serious to think about and to worry about. The Syrian army fielded the latest version Russian tank, the T-72. It was rushed into combat on the very last day of fighting between the Israeli and Syrian armies in the Bekaa Valley. The T-72 had been considered in the West to be the best tank around. The estimates in NATO were that the T-72 could not be penetrated by any armor-piercing ordnance that the West possessed from the front. Now, T-72s were hit and were knocked out and were penetrated from the front in the fighting. And so if we sum up this experience plus many other areas that we don't have the time to deal with here this evening, I think we find that that perception that has existed in the East and in the West regarding the force ratio in conventional terms between East and West, that perception is open for re-examination. And you know that it had been the basic assumption of East-West relationships and strategy for many years now, that the Russians enjoyed an overwhelming advantage over the West when it came to conventional forces. That if there were to be fighting in Western Europe between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, the Russians would be able to slice through to the Atlantic in a matter of 48 or 72 hours. On that assumption was based the theory of the nuclear deterrent, of the need to go nuclear almost immediately if fighting were to break out, because the West was too weak conventionally. On the nuclear deterrent was based much of the disarray in the Western camp. The Western European countries not wanting to expose themselves to nuclear warfare, and the terrible cry that has been heard in Western Europe, better red than dead. All that is open for re-examination. And if any of you have read one of Brezhnev's last speeches about 10 days before he died to the senior generals of the Soviet armed forces, you will find that he mentioned Lebanon once in his speech, but that in effect most of his speech had to do with Lebanon and the lessons that the Russians had to learn from the Lebanese operation. And so I feel that Israel's operation in the Lebanon has brought forth a major geopolitical change of benefit to the West, of benefit to the United States. And it may not be too far-fetched to think that the fate of those countries for so many years now, since World War II, under the heel of Soviet oppression, Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, that maybe even their fate may be affected and affected favorably as a result of Israel's military operation in the Lebanon. I think that there is an appreciation of the achievements that I've discussed with you in Washington. I wouldn't say that there is total agreement on everything. On some subjects, you'll be told that It is too early to draw the bottom line. The final conclusions cannot as yet been reached, but I think the general trend of events is appreciated. And so, maybe you are surprised that there are differences of opinion between Israel and the United States, that there have been differences of opinion rather frequently during the Lebanese operation, and that there are differences of opinion even at the present time. These differences of opinion do not reflect conflicts of interest. Israel and the United States not only share common values and common traditions, Israel being the only democratic country in the Middle East, but because we share common values and common traditions, in this ideologically polarized world, we share common interests. And the interests of Israel and the United States are essentially identical in the Middle East. We share the very same goals. That does not mean that we always agree on the appropriate means to pursue these goals. That does not mean that we always agree regarding the tactics. This all of you know. Husband and wife, business partners, nations can share the same goals and can disagree, and sometimes disagree very strongly about the tactics to be used in pursuing these goals. Why do we have these disagreements? Why do we have these differences of perceptions when we view the same area, the same problems, when we want to pursue the very same goals? Well, part of it maybe is really inevitable. Things do not look the same from Washington as they do from Jerusalem. We are closer to events. We are living in the area. Sometimes this may give us a better knowledge of the problems we are facing than you might get in Washington. Sometimes maybe we are not as objective as maybe you can be from very far away. I do think that one of the reasons for the differences of opinion that occur, that are bound to occur, has to do with the fact that the Middle East is not as well known in the United States as it is in Israel. And frequently I find people in the United States looking at the Middle East and thinking that they are looking at the Middle West, and thinking that they can apply the norms and the terminology and the concepts that are applicable in the Western world, in the North American continent or in Western Europe, to the Middle East. And they forget that this is a different part of the world with different norms, with different traditions, with long traditions of brutality, of fanaticism, of lack of tolerance for minorities, in effect an area almost continuously at war, covered by hostility, the Iraqis fighting the Iranians, the North Yemenis, the South Yemenis, the Ethiopians, the Somalis, and so on down the line. You can hardly find a Middle Eastern country that lives at real peace with its neighbor. And so some of the differences of opinion that we've had have had to do with a perception gap. Before Israel's military operation in the Lebanon, President Reagan had expressed his opinion that the PLO must cease its terrorist activity against Israel, that PLO terrorism must be removed from southern Lebanon. President Reagan had talked about the need of the Syrians removing their surface-to-air missiles from the Bekaa Valley, but the administration in Washington believed that this could be obtained, these ends could be obtained by diplomatic means. I felt that Ambassador Habib, by shuttling back and forth, could convince the PLO to pick up and get out of the area, could convince the Syrians to take their surface-to-air missiles and move them out of Lebanon. And we didn't believe it. We gave that process some time, but we didn't think that end could be achieved because we felt we knew the reality in the Middle East, and that unfortunately there was no choice but the exercise of force with all the costs that entailed if we were serious about bringing about these ends. We faced a similar difference of opinion when the PLO was bottled up in West Beirut on how we would get them to leave West Beirut. And we knew, in Israel and you in the United States, the administration recognized that, there would be no independent Lebanon until the PLO had evacuated West Beirut. There could be no sovereign Lebanese government that did not control its own capital. But we felt, with all due respect to Ambassador Habib's efforts, that unless there was also some military pressure on the PLO, unless they felt that they were faced by the imminent threat of a military action, unless they agreed to get out as a result of the negotiations, that the negotiations were not going to succeed. And I think that today, in retrospect, we can state with some certainty that had it not been for the pressure of the Israeli armed forces on the PLO in West Beirut, the PLO would probably still be sitting in West Beirut. I think that the major lesson in U.S.-Israeli relationships that should be drawn from recent events in the area is that when Israel and the United States work in concert, when our efforts are coordinated, we can make very great achievements. I think today that many of the fears that were so prevalent in the Western world, and particularly in the United States, regarding the possibility of critical events in the Middle East, regarding the loss of oil supplies to the Western world, I believe that many of these fears are not there anymore today. The whole atmosphere, the whole environment, the reality of the Middle East has changed. And I think in the Arab world and possibly even in the Soviet Union, it is clear today that if Israel and the United States work together in concert, they can take care of all of the possible contingencies in the Middle East. They can protect the vital interests of the Western world in that part of the world. And so my appeal when I talk to the government of the United States or when I talk to the public, as I do here tonight, is please let us work in concert. We may not always be able to work in harmony, but we must find ways of overcoming the differences that we have on tactics so that we can achieve our common objectives. And if we continue to do that as we have done in the past, I don't think we need to fear Soviet penetration of the Middle East. I don't think we need to fear oil boycotts or the rise in the price of oil. And I think that we have reason to hope that we may even make some progress towards peace in the area.
And observations on the advantages accrued to the Western world by the Israeli actions in Lebanon recently, for your views of the prospects for American-Israeli cooperation. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions until 7:15. You can ask the questions from your seat or from one of the 3 microphones in the aisles. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, it seems to me, and I don't mean to editorialize, but your account of the Israeli action vis-a-vis Lebanon differs from the accounts which I have read in several newspapers, in as much as it seems to me to be rather antiseptic. Well, my question is, how do you answer the critics both in your own country and in especially the Jewish community in the United States, that Israel, by its action in Lebanon, by its aggressive resettlement of the West Bank, has perhaps lost its soul? In other words, it seems not to be conducting actions to simply preserve its national security, but it seems to be attempting or engaged in a process of self-aggrandizement. I wish you would respond to that. And one other thing, in your account, I heard no mention of the Israeli well, the episode in Lebanon, which might be compared with, our My Lai. Would you also voice, some sentiment regarding that particular episode?
Sure. Well, I didn't mean to make Israel's military operation in Lebanon sound antiseptic, because there's no such thing as an antiseptic military operation. Unfortunately, any kind of warfare or combat involves the loss of lives, the loss of soldiers. 400 young men in Israel gave their lives for their country during the military operation in Lebanon, and it involves the loss of civilian life, innocent civilian life, particularly in the operation in Lebanon, because the PLO saw to it that it emplaced its guns and its rockets and its headquarters right in the middle of the centers of civilian population. But I can tell you in all sincerity that never in the annals of warfare has an army taken such care and such pains in an attempt to avoid civilian casualties as did the Israeli army in Lebanon. And never in the annals of warfare has an army sacrificed so many of its soldiers in an attempt to avoid civilian casualties as the Israeli army has done in the Lebanon. So antiseptic, no, there's no such thing as fighting antiseptically. I don't think there's an army around that has fought antiseptically, but I would add immediately, I think there is probably not an army around that has fought in the manner that the Israeli army, the Israel Defense Forces, fought in the Lebanon. Do you lose your soul by fighting? Well, I can only tell you that in the Middle East, you lose your body if you don't fight. And there's no soul when there's no body. The best example of this are two countries in the Middle East, Lebanon and Israel. Lebanon was weak, did not have the ability to defend itself. Nobody had any, what you would call, legitimate grievances against Lebanon. It was guilty of one thing and one thing only. It was not strong enough to protect itself. And so it was dragged into endless years of bloodshed. Lebanese society, the Lebanese government, almost destroyed. Lebanon's towns and villages occupied by foreign forces. That is the fate of any country and any people living in the Middle East that cannot defend itself. And Israel, strong by making a very great effort to be strong. By the way, an effort that cannot be made without a soul. There isn't a country on this globe that is making the allocation of resources to defense that Israel is making. Not only in money. In the United States, you are concerned about the economy because you now spend 6% of your gross national product on defense. We in Israel spend almost 30% of our gross national product of defense. But we also allocate human resources. Our sons and daughters serve in the army. Our sons, a good part of their lifetimes. Why do we do this? Because we are convinced that we are faced by a physical threat to our very existence, and that this is what it takes in order to stay alive. So, thank God we have preserved our bodies, and I assure you that with our bodies, we've also preserved our souls. I know that an attempt is made to draw an analogy between the U.S. experience in Vietnam and Israel's experience in Lebanon, and I see that you try to draw the analogy between My Lai and Sabra and Shatila. I don't think that there is much connection or much of an analogy. The basic issue, as I understood it in the United States regarding the Vietnam experience, was why was the United States in Vietnam in the first place? And now that the United States has left Vietnam, I suppose the question that is raised is, was there any reason for the United States to get involved in Vietnam? And I suppose most people are happy that the United States has disengaged itself from Vietnam. That choice of disengagement, of getting out, of not being involved, never faced Israel in the Lebanon, because we live in the Middle East and we can't leave the Middle East. And our towns and cities were bombarded from Lebanon. The cities and towns of the United States were not bombarded from South Vietnam. We live in that area and we have to protect our population. It's an action that we had to take. And today we cannot leave Lebanon until we have assured ourselves that there will not be renewed bombardment of Israel's towns and villages. So this is not the situation the United States faced in Vietnam. I'm not an expert on the My Lai affair. To the best of my knowledge, this was a massacre that had been carried on by American troops in the area. Now you know only too well that no Israeli troops were involved in the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, that no Israelis pulled any kind of triggers. And if you've seen the agony and anguish on the faces of Israelis on TV screens here, it has been the agony that has seized them. Why? Because they thought that maybe we bore some small percentage of indirect responsibility. That maybe we could have mitigated it, and that maybe we could have stopped it. Not because we did it. And we have taken this step that I think is unprecedented in the annals of democratic governments. To the best of my knowledge, it's never been done before. That an independent judicial inquiry committee has been set up to investigate the government's action in relation to that massacre. To investigate the government, the prime minister, the ministers of the government, and the Israeli army. I don't believe that this is ever done before. So all I can say in summary is, if you remember that we live in the Middle East and not in the Middle West, that we're faced with very difficult problems, similar to the kind of problems that other democratic societies have faced. And if you want to judge us, please judge us on a relative scale and ask, how are we doing as compared to other democratic governments when they face similar situations? And I think that when you do that, you'll find that maybe we have to be rated quite highly.
Mr. Leisberg?
Israel's primary objective is one of peace. Could you describe what you envision over the next 5 years might be steps that Israel would take or participate in, primarily in Lebanon and secondarily on the West Bank, to obtain this objective?
Well, I really feel it is superfluous, but nevertheless I do it because sometimes I sense that there may be a question about it, to emphasize that there is nobody in the world, or for that matter in the Middle East, who is more interested in arriving at peace than is Israel. I've just a minute ago talked about the very heavy burden that we carry on our shoulders because of the absence of peace in the area. We pay the price for there not being peace. And we pay the price in the lives of our sons and daughters. Making peace in the Middle East is not an easy matter. There are two preconditions for accommodation and peaceful settlement in the area. They are necessary conditions, they are not even sufficient conditions. The first, a very unusual one in any other part of the world. The first precondition is that an Arab country that is considering making peace with Israel realizes and recognizes that it has no military option against Israel. Because if it feels that it has the military option, it will try to exercise it, as have Arab countries in the past 34 years of Israel's existence. You just look at Iran and Iraq. There were no legitimate grievances. There was peace. There were diplomatic relations. Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, was the man who signed the latest agreement with the Iranians. But the very moment where he thought that he had a military option and could achieve his goals by warfare, he went ahead and tried to do it. Turned out he miscalculated, but he went ahead and tried to do it. So that's the first requirement. And with all due respect to Anwar Sadat, had he not come to the recognition after the Yom Kippur War and his generals around him that Egypt did not have a military option against Israel, that whatever was going to be achieved would have to be achieved by negotiations, even he would not have been able to come to Jerusalem to negotiate a peaceful settlement with Israel. The second necessary requirement is that Arab countries feel an incentive, a need, a desire, that Arab rulers feel that it is worth their while to make peace with Israel, that they will be better off after having signed a peace than they are without such a peace treaty. Now, in the Western world, we tend to think that if two countries are at war, they are both interested in arriving at a peace settlement. The question is only whether they can agree on the terms. That is not true in the Middle East. Any one of you can name, as I can, a list of Middle Eastern countries that have no incentive at all and no desire to make peace with Israel, regardless of the circumstances, except for Israel's liquidation. Colonel Gaddafi in Libya has no desire to make peace with Israel. There's nothing in it for him. He fortifies his dictatorial rule in Lebanon by playing on hostility to Israel. The same is true for Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The same is true for Assad in Syria. I'm not sure, but it may even be true, possibly to a lesser extent, when we talk about Hussein in Jordan. Certainly the feudal rulers in Saudi Arabia have no incentive to make peace with Israel. What's in it for them? They're not threatened by Israel. They're not being attacked by Israel. They are using their hostility towards Israel. So it is in this environment that you have to appraise whatever action and initiative Israel can take and whatever risks Israel will take upon itself in arriving at a peace settlement in the area. I think the most important thing to be said regarding the ways of achieving peace in the Middle East is that the pattern for peacemaking in the Middle East has been set by Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Face-to-face direct negotiations without any preconditions. And until such time as another Arab leader is ready to do exactly that, without coaxing, without urging, without being promised what the final results of the negotiations are going to be, step forward and negotiate face-to-face and directly with Israel. Until such time, progress is going to be slow. We are fighting that battle in the Lebanon right now because we want the president of Lebanon, who owes Israel a great debt of gratitude, to come forward and negotiate a peace treaty with Israel. And maybe after he has done so, maybe King Hussein of Jordan will step forward as well.
Dr. Banks.
Mr. Ambassador, in your remarks, you made reference to the view that the U.S. and Israel must work together in concert, but not always in harmony. I wonder, given the fact that there were many folk in this country that supported Israel's announced intention to develop enclaves 25 miles north of Israel, but were mystified that Israel moved forward in terms of Beirut, in terms of that action. I wonder if you would comment as to what has been the feedback you've gotten vis-a-vis the reaction since Beirut, Shatila, Sabra, and other reactions. And I make this point, Mr. Ambassador, because the reaction I get is twofold. One, supportive of the enclave concept, 25 miles, for security, but one of great alarm in relation to Beirut and subsequent actions that have followed. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, I think that probably many of the questions and doubts that were raised regarding the details of Israel's military operation, the fact that the Israel Defense Forces in some parts of the sector did not end the operation at the 25-mile point, but are actually today maybe at the 30-mile point. The way it's described, sometimes you might think they're at the 300-mile point. But actually from Beirut to Israel's border, it's only about 32 miles as the crow flies. I think a lot of these questions really have been dispelled primarily as a result of the most recent events. Because as people in the United States see that Israel is not only ready, but eager to get out of Lebanon. You know, the Israeli army is an army of reservists. It's made up of students who should be going to college. instead of sitting in positions in the Lebanon. It's made up of workers and managers who should be in offices and in the factories rather than sitting out there. As people see that Israel is eager to move out, but does want to assure itself of the basic and necessary condition that there not be a reversal, that in the wake of the Israeli withdrawal, the PLO doesn't come back in with its guns and with its rocketry, I think as people appreciate that, they also understand why the Israeli Defense Forces had to go as far as they did, and why, if the PLO had remained in western Beirut, probably the Israeli withdrawal would inevitably be accompanied by a return, by a rollback of the PLO into southern Lebanon. And I would not at all be surprised, even though some of Lebanon's leaders today might be a little hesitant in stating this publicly, if they privately would not admit, if they privately do not recognize that their only hope for the Syrian army to leave, for the PLO terrorists to get out of Lebanon, for Lebanon to become independent again, is dependent on the positions that the Israeli Defense Forces holds at this very moment. And if for a moment you were to assume that the Israeli people were to say, we're tired of all this, let's get our army back home, regardless of what happens in Lebanon, I think everybody knows that's the end of whatever hope we have for an independent Lebanon. The Syrian army will stay, the PLO will come back, and that's the renewal of the Lebanese tragedy.
Mr. Blumberg.
You speak of a perception gap. I think that some of us who are sympathetic or empathetic to Israel find it very painful to have you, as the leading representative of the United States, have to explain Israel's conduct. In the light of that, what is the Israeli government doing in order to improve its public relations here in the United States and its public behavior so as not to have to go through these very painful explanations?
Well, I know that there are many people in the United States who today earn a living in the area of public relations, and so I assume there are lots of experts around. I'm not sure that they always agree, and I hasten to add that I'm not one of these experts, although I'm sure it would be very helpful in my job if I had that kind of expertise. Explaining Israel's position, establishing better public relations for Israel in the United States is very important for Israel. It's not at all easy to do. And we have noticed in the media in the United States, I would say, a certain distortion in the descriptions of events in the Lebanon. I think on occasion even a certain bias in some of the media. It is clear to me that the Arab lobby is very active on the scene. It is clear that many organizations and many business enterprises who have close business connections with the Arab world have somehow been mobilized into this effort as well. So I think it has been an inherently difficult job. I don't want to be in a position of telling you that we have to be given good marks of dealing with that job as effectively as we could. All I can tell you is that we are constantly re-examining ourselves to see what we have to do in order to do our public relations job in a better manner.
Mr. Blumberg.
Mr. Ambassador, in the Foreign Affairs edition, spring 1982, the Crown Prince of Jordan talked about the degree of cooperation in operating the West Bank between Israel and Jordan. He said, and I quote, "After all, it is Jordan that is paying the salaries of the notables on the West Bank. After all, it is Jordan that is participating in public works." Now, in view of this existing degree of cooperation, even though it's not formalized, as far as I know, by any written document or treaty, do you believe that this is a point of departure or an approach when combined with the autonomy plan for bringing around peace in the Mideast between Jordan and Israel?
Well, you know, I feel I must remind you of the fact when we talk about Jordanian-Israeli relationships and how they relate to Judea and Samaria, or what you here call the West Bank, that area was conquered by the Jordanian army in 1948. that the Jewish settlements that existed in the West Bank were destroyed by the Jordanian army, that most of the people in the area were killed, and whatever were not killed were expelled, that for 19 years while Jordan ruled the West Bank, there were no peace negotiations, no readiness to talk peace with Israel, that quite the contrary, in 1967, in June of 1967, Hussein joined Nasser by attacking Israel from the West Bank in an attempt to bring about the liquidation of Israel. The fear of the Hashemite family in Jordan, of which Prince Hassan, Crown Prince Hassan, of course, is a member, their fear is a fear for the stability of their own regime, and they were concerned in the past, during the days that they ruled the West Bank, that the Palestinian Arab population in the West Bank, possibly with some of the Palestinian Arab population that lives in the East Bank in Jordan, would bring about the overthrow of the Hashemite kingdom. And this almost happened in September of 1970. And their fear in past years, at least in my opinion, has been that maybe the autonomy regime that was supposed to have been set up as a result of the Camp David Accords would bring to the fore some Palestinian Arab leadership in the West Bank that in the final analysis could end up being a danger to the stability of Hussein's regime on the East Bank of the Jordan River. That is the reason why he has been paying salaries to various officials and various people in the population in the West Bank. Not because he's trying to cooperate with Israel, but he's trying to use economic resources that mostly come, by the way, from Saudi Arabia in order to buy the loyalty of some of the people in the area. So I would not go so far as to say that that's an indication of potential cooperation between Israel and Jordan.
Mrs. Hassler?
A few minutes ago, a questioner asked you what steps Israel was prepared to take in the next 5 years towards peace in the Middle East, and your answer had to do with what steps the Arabs should take towards peace in the U.S. I wonder if I should conclude from that Israel is not prepared to take any steps towards recognizing the rights of the indigenous people of Palestine, or withdrawing from Lebanon that would foster peace.
Well, I can only reiterate what I said before, and I don't think that the implication that you mentioned is at all consistent with what I've said. I think it is rather obvious that the first step towards peace is direct face-to-face negotiations between the leaders of the countries who are trying to make peace. Not only is this the obvious way that peace and accommodation has been handled in the past, this is not theory in the Middle East either. That's what it took to bring about peace between Israel and Egypt. And that is what it's going to take to bring about peace between Israel and Jordan, and maybe someday between Israel and Syria. That is the most important step. That is the most crucial step. Everything else is extraneous. Any attempts to coax and urge Arab leaders to the negotiating table by negotiating by proxy, by holding out to them the promise of what they're going to attain, or by guaranteeing to them the end results, brought nothing before Sadat came to Jerusalem, and there were many attempts like that made, will bring nothing in my mind in the future. They've got to come forward and start negotiating peace. And when they do, they will find out what Israel is ready to give in the negotiating process. As Sadat found out. And Sadat found out that Israel was very giving and very compromising, and made concessions that I think even he in his wildest dreams didn't think that Israel was going to make. But you've got to come forward and start negotiating if you're going to have a chance to view any of these concessions.
Sir, the concrete aspect of U.S.-Israeli partnership has generally been the substantial economic and military aid provided by the U.S. to Israel. I believe either in December or the new session in January, the Congress will consider the administration's latest aid proposal, which, as I recall, is in the range of $400 million, or on that order.
Which is what?
Is on the range of about $400 million.
Oh, it's more than that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I wonder, from your viewpoint, would you, since there seems to be some opposition in Congress this time around, would you expect to get the administration's full amount, or part of it, none of it? And what, as ambassador, would you say to a reluctant congressman to change that person's mind?
Well, first of all, as regards the facts, the administration has proposed to Congress that the aid to Israel in the next fiscal year will be on the order of $800 million in economic aid and about $1.7 billion in military aid. A lot of this in the form of loans at commercial interest rates, about a third of it in the forms of grants to Israel. Actually, the position of Congress to date, and it is under discussion these very days, the position of the Appropriations Committee of the Senate and the Appropriations Committee of the House is that U.S. aid to Israel should be increased over and above the sums that the administration has proposed. And there has been some sort of a dialogue and maybe even a discussion between congressional leaders and the administration, with Congress urging a larger measure of aid, a higher percentage of grants as opposed to loans than what the administration had suggested. As regards the question that is frequently asked, whether this measure of aid to Israel can be justified in terms of United States interests, I've seen people make the calculation and talk about the number of dollars per man, woman, and child that the U.S. taxpayer passes to Israel. And this, of course, creates the impression that every man, woman, and child puts a couple of $100 of U.S. tax money into his pocket, and nothing is farther from the truth. But that question, of course, is addressed, and I know that foreign aid, as such, is really not very popular with many U.S. taxpayers, and many American congressmen tell me that it is not popular in their constituency. They believe in it, but they have trouble selling it in their constituency. I tell them what I believe to be the case, that this happens to be one of the best investments that the United States makes. The United States has a defense budget of about $250 billion, or $200 billion. The grants provided to Israel are less than 1% of that budget. I think that if you compare the returns to U.S. security interests for those investments made in aid to Israel, they are more value per dollar than probably much of the other components of the U.S. defense budget. And I think that's the justification from the United States point of view of U.S. aid to Israel.
Well, while I know several of you still have questions, we did promise the ambassador that we would end promptly at 7:15. Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to thank you for giving us a clear perspective of the positions of the Israeli government today. We thank you very much for your generosity in sharing your time and for your fullness in answering our questions. Thank you very much.